Computer, yes. Okay. All right, welcome everyone to another masterclass hosted by the University of Michigan Bassoon Studio. We are online again today because of the shelter-in-place order here in Michigan due to the coronavirus, and I hope you are all sheltered in a nice place. Our guest today is David Wells, lecturer of Bassoon and Music History at California State University, Sacramento. But before we begin, I'd like to thank Dean David Gier of the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance and the Sally Fleming Masterclass Fund for providing the financial support to host this class. This is the fourth and final masterclass of the 2019-2020 academic year, a year in which we've been celebrating the career, the music, the teaching, and the 95th birthday of my teacher, Bernard Garfield. All year, we've been looking at the ways his teaching directly influenced me and how it has been passed on to my students, and finally, how those students have carved very different careers for themselves. These four classes have featured four bassoonists with very different profiles in the broad discipline of music performance, and I believe today's guest has one of the most varied careers of any guest we've ever hosted. So, welcome to David Wells. David, why don't you begin the class by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background, how you started playing the bassoon, where you studied after your undergraduate work with me at Arizona State, and how you ended up in Sacramento.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Had a path to the bassoon that probably is similar for a lot of you. That I played other woodwinds first. When I got the chance to join band in fifth grade, we had a flute in the house, so I picked that up. That was easy. I didn't love it. Started making my way downwards in the woodwind section to clarinet, and then I wanted to play saxophone, but there weren't any. And my band director happened to be a bassoonist. So one summer he rounded up all the bassoons he could find, which was probably 4 or 5, and started a handful of us on bassoon. And I just sort of took to it immediately. I think I was gravitating towards lower pitched instruments, and I've always been sort of a fan of the esoteric and weird, so the bassoon, of course, was a perfect fit for that. And then as Jeff already mentioned, did my undergraduate study with him when he was at Arizona State. And from there, I went on to master's study at Florida State University with Jeff Kiesecker, and from there to doctoral study at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with Mark Vallone. And after that, moved pretty much right away after the summer after I finished my DMA to Northern California. My wife, Veronica, is a music librarian, an academic music librarian, and it surprised neither of us that when we both finished grad school at the same time, there were more academic library jobs than there were bassoon professor jobs. So she got a job first, and we moved to California. And I started just building networks here, and found out pretty quickly that there was a need for a bassoon teacher at Sacramento State just about a year later, and managed to get in there. And so I commute a little ways. She's at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, and I'm at Sacramento State. But we feel lucky to be an academic couple living in the same place, which is not true for everybody.
So you mentioned studying with Mark Vallone, who is at Wisconsin and who himself trained at the Paris Conservatoire. So I was wondering if his teaching differs significantly with, teaching that you found at two other American universities with American trained bassoonists, or if that former masterclass format at the Paris Conservatoire just wasn't used at Wisconsin. Is there anything that you would say is markedly different between Mark's French style of teaching and typical American bassoon studio?
I don't think it was hugely different in structure. We didn't do the Allard style, sort of group lesson almost style thing. We had our weekly studio class, master classes, but those were the same as I've had everywhere else. I think the thing I noticed maybe the most was a difference in just some of the more specific approaches. He has, not only did he start on the French bassoon, and later moved to the German system. Um, but he's, of course, also a period instrument specialist. And so there were all sorts of bits of information of, while I was working on something on modern bassoon, like, oh, well, try this fingering that we use on the French bassoon, or try this that comes from the Baroque way of doing things, or try this. So I think most of what I got about things from the Paris Conservatoire were the more technical sorts of things, and figuring out how to apply some of those to the German bassoon.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned the period instrument playing, and that is one of the specializations. Sorry, Astro. One of the specializations that you've entered into in your career, and we are getting, thanks with some of your help and advice, we are getting two sharer copy instruments from Guntram Wolf, and we're taking delivery of them hopefully very soon, depending on this virus. And so since so many of the students in my studio are going to be interested in learning that, why don't you talk a while about how you came to be interested in period instrument performance? Like, what what first attracted you to that style of playing?
Well, I've had a sort of long and varied history and interest with period instrument performance in general, long before I ever really got into it. I mean, my first sort of memories of music making myself were playing Pretorius duets on recorders with my father, and we would go hear, recorder ensembles and things when I was a kid, and
Okay.
amidst lots of other sorts of music that I was exposed to as a kid. But so I had already sort of started to be interested in Baroque music a bit, fairly early on, whether I knew what to call it or not.
Yeah.
I think the first Baroque ensemble I played in was at Arizona State. I recall it was maybe my sophomore year. I remember telling you that I was interested in it. I think you took
Right.
me right up to see John Metz and see
Right.
what we can do. And I spent the semester of the year playing in a chamber group that I think was violin, flute, harpsichord, and with me playing continuo.
Mhm.
And everybody else had Baroque instruments at 415, and I was playing my Fox 240. So I spent the year transposing down a half step, which was an excellent mental exercise. F flat minor is a heck of a key to play in.
Right.
But that sort of was my introduction to playing in the style. I think, even though I was using a modern bassoon. When I got to Florida State, they have an incredible collection of instruments and a bunch of early music ensembles. And a friend in the bassoon studio who was also interested in, who was already doing that, sort of pulled me in first to play in Isham band, recorder ensemble, um, Baroque oboe band, even playing with baritone oboe, things like that. And the really great thing was, once you were in one of those ensembles, you had access to all of the instruments. It was just in a room with a code. And in one of my trips in there, as I was hunting around, I noticed that there was a Baroque bassoon, an old Ross Levin Eichentopf, sitting in a cabinet not getting used. So that was the first Baroque bassoon, or period bassoon at all, that I'd ever actually played. And I got it out and found a reed that had probably been there for 2 decades and made it work. And I happened to be playing the Telemann F minor sonata on my master's recital. And Jeff Kiestiker suggested, like, well, why don't you just try it on that bassoon, and just to see what it's like. And I did, and thought, okay, well, this kind of works. It's, there's lots of things I don't understand about this instrument, but can sort of make it work. And I made the perhaps foolhardy decision to actually perform it on that bassoon. That's sort of a minimum of instruction.
Yeah.
Got a little bit from the other people in the early ensemble, but then that sort of kindled this, or renewed this interest I had, and specific to bassoon in particular. So that was certainly one thing when I was looking at DMA programs. One reason that Mark, and I think you told me about Mark,
Right.
He was fairly recently arrived in the U.S. at that point. Really interested me about him was all of his period instrument experience, and that turned out to be a really great fit. He, while I was there, of course, I was studying modern bassoon, and there's no degree program in early bassoon there. But Mark has a magnificent collection of instruments, and when I was there, he had 4 Baroque bassoons, and pretty much always 3 of them were in the hands of students who would just loan them out to us. So I was able to get instruction from him at that point. He also has a number of 19th century bassoons, and I crafted a lecture recital that would let me play 3 of those.
Wow.
And so that was the point that I really got into it. Of course.
And how, so you get the instruments, you start experimenting with them. Um, what was the approach that Mark took as he really started you with a formal instruction? Like, um, did you, was it basically what I would call a referential approach, where you're taking what you know of the modern bassoon and you're making adjustments, fingering wise, pitch wise, reed wise for the Baroque bassoon? Or did you start over in some way? Like did you start as if you were a beginning bassoonist on the Baroque instruments?
I think it was maybe a combination of the two, and for the most part, it was a sort of, here's the instrument, go see what you can figure out.
Right.
Here's some starting tips, then come back and we'll do some work and
Right.
see where you are. So I think he encouraged us to take to look at it as a different instrument,
Uh-huh.
to realize that we had sort of a core of the fingering system that we could rely on, and that it would feel like a somewhat familiar thing, not a totally different posture or anything like that, but that because of how different the air use is, how different voicing can be, how different the reeds are, all of that, it's beneficial, I think, to just start off almost like it's a brand new thing.
Well, let's get really nerdy with this. So what do you mean by the differences of the air?
The way I would support on the modern bassoon, especially think in the tenor range, think the stuffiest notes around C, D, above the staff, above the bass clef staff. If I was to play with that much air on the Baroque bassoon, it just kind of overdrives the whole thing, and it just doesn't work.
Uh-huh.
And this is, part of what's so great about the Baroque instrument in particular, but period bassoons in general, is that they tend to be so much more flexible than the modern instrument, which is both an asset and a liability.
Right.
They have great flexibility of tone color, of articulation. If anyone's read any treatises by Krantz or others who talk about all of the little details of different articulations, different consonant sounds, and then you try them on your modern bassoon and you say, okay, well, those all sound the same. Well, they actually do sound different on the Baroque instruments.
Mhm.
If we think of it, you're using less air, and within that, you can get more subtle variations in all sorts of things. Also, the instrument demands that. The flexibility extends to pitch as well,
Yeah.
so it does not slot in to notes as well as the modern instrument does.
Yeah, flexible is a very is a very nice way of talking about pitch on the Baroque bassoon. I think, yeah, random might be a better way, but
yeah, if you believe hard enough, you can get a note very different from the fingering that you're playing.
yes. Yeah, we have one of those Eikentop, the early Levin Ross ones too, and it's funny that the B and B flat can be either one. You just you don't necessarily know which one is coming out. But okay, so you then got instruction experience. What was one of the first? You mentioned a lecture recital with several different instruments. Tell us about that.
So that this was part of my set of recitals for my DMA, and people at Madison will tie their lecture recital into their dissertation or their doctoral project, whatever that is. Mine, I saw pretty early that wasn't going to work. My dissertation was a history and discography of the bassoon in jazz, and I didn't know how I was going to turn that into a lecture recital effectively. So I thought, okay, what else could I do? Realized that Mark had all these instruments and is very generous with them with the students. So I got from him an 1820 Salary Jeune, an 1859 Heckel, and an 1891 Buffet. And decided that since these were three instruments, well, two French instruments and one German, but one from before the French-German split, and then a fairly well-established mid-century Heckel, and then late buffet. I played pieces. I selected pieces that were as close as I could find to the time and place of manufacture of each of the instruments. So for the Savary, I played the Coquin Guillaume Tell Fantasy.
Oh yeah, good.
Because presumably Savaries would have been played at the Opera for William Tell originally. For the Heckel, I played the Spohr Adagio, and that was I think I stretched that a little bit. That was published around that time. It was written actually much earlier, but published in the 1850s. And then the buffet, I played. What did I play? It was I think one of the Jancourt solos, the Neuvième solo, I think. And yeah, so I played each of those pieces, and it took me a long time to figure out how to make reeds for each of these instruments and find fingerings that would work. And I referenced lots of historical fingering charts, but also just had to experiment and see what worked for me. Most of those old charts don't offer more than one choice for a given note, and as we all know, the bassoon doesn't work like that.
Right. Well, let's get a demonstration or two, and then I still have more questions about the way you've incorporated these instruments into your career. But I think it would be a good time to actually hear the sound of a couple of them.
Sure. Yeah. Let me see. Grab one thing here. So maybe one thing I can do is just give you a demonstration, just a little of what I was talking about with air before.
Okay.
Sorry, I have one thing not quite set here. There we go. So here's my Baroque bassoon. This is a copy of an Eichentopf by Robert Cronin, or actually Rufus Acosta, who has taken over the workshop from him. Made in San Jose, not far from me. So let me play the opening phrase of the first of Telemann's fantasies, originally for solo flute. That's what I've been practicing most recently on this instrument. Let me play it the way I would normally play it first. Now, if I think for a second like the modern bassoon, grab my Puchner here. If I just play a little to reacquaint myself with what this feels like, note that there will be a pitch difference. Okay, if I try to play with the same air I just used, back here. It just doesn't work. It's just too much for the instrument to handle. But there's just a lot more subtlety. I don't know how well that's coming through.
No, it's working. Yeah.
But yeah, and I find I can play more quietly, more easily with this, and so much. One thing that I really like about playing the period instruments is how much they reveal about the music and how much sense a lot of the parts make. Much more sense often than they do on the modern instrument. and I think it's about removing sort of the layers of innovation. You know, particularly the 19th century changes to make the instrument able to play higher, faster, louder, more chromatically, all of that. And when we go back to music written before those demands were imposed on the instrument, it's much easier often to play them on the instruments that don't have those extra things. So let me give you a little bit of Vivaldi's, one of his A minor concerti, 497. So, which starts off with all of these leaps, a lot of octave and greater than octave leaps. That opening feels very nice and natural on this instrument. When I go over here, it becomes a flicking fest. And should just show you, just to be sure, notice how bare my wing joint is on this instrument. There's nothing there. So your left thumb gets quite a bit of a break on that instrument. You know, when I play that over here, it's just moving constantly. So there's all this extra effort that goes into doing this.
Yeah, I always find it funny that when I do get a chance to play a Baroque bassoon again, my thumb is always dancing around these keys that aren't there and
Right.
trying to activate something, but you know, you get a chance to just let the thing sit there. So okay, so sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And just the sort of leaping around, you know, on the modern instrument, we really need to flick or have the no flick system or whatever to get between octaves effectively. But as long as I remember to half hold on G, it's much easier on this instrument. And I didn't get out my classical bassoon, but another specific experience I had in something that felt much easier, or certainly easier than I expected on the period instrument, was the last page of the Mozart C minor serenade, that the bassoon solo. I'll do a little on
Yeah. Right.
You know, and it just goes on from there with more and more leaping and lots of octave stuff. That's very thumb intensive and very sort of awkward on the modern bassoon. And so much of it just goes as long as you have the proper control of air. And again, it's all about the subtleties within the maybe less intense airstream. As long as you can navigate that, it will happily jump between octaves.
Well, Peter's got our first question here. Peter, why don't you ask what you wanted to ask?
So I guess I'm just a little confused. I understand that it really comes across that it's much easier to produce the octaves on the period instrument, but then are you doing that all with air? Is it just that the fingerings are different? How is that happening easier?
It's nearly all with air. I mean, there are differences in fingerings. You know, for instance, you know, G's, we still half hole fourth space G. So that's how we get that out. A, the second A, you actually cover what would be the pancake key, and that helps jump. That helps stabilize the upper note. But if I actually, when I just did it, I did it without that, and it still jumped fairly well. C is identical. It's just all about air in that case. So it is still some change in fingering, but it's really about airstream.
Now, is that vocal that you're using, does that have the vent hole drilled into it?
It does, yeah. So there's a tiny, I don't know if I can get that close enough, tiny little hole right there, which does help get those upper notes out. Some people like to have a little piece of rubber band or tubing here to slide and close that to make low notes more secure. I find that I don't need it. I don't have any trouble getting low notes out quietly, but you know, you can imagine it, if the hole's a little too big, then it's like having your whisper key open and trying to play the bottom end of the instrument. But this is so tiny that I think it works fine.
Okay, we have another question about the reed from Daniel. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering what are the main differences between a Baroque style reed to a modern reed, and like difference in sizes and
Sure.
scraping.
So here, is this in focus? I can't tell.
Yeah.
Cool. So here's my modern reed and my Baroque reed. This is a Fox 2, and this is a Gier B5B. My Baroque reeds are, well, I think one thing is there's a lot even more variation in Baroque reed sizes and shapes than in modern reed sizes and shapes. And my Baroque reeds are shorter than what a lot of people use. So I start with 140 millimeter cane, but I cut it down to 132. And there are a lot of people who play, particularly the Wolf HKICW, HKCIW, one of those, who play with the B5B, which is a fairly large shape, and full 140 millimeter cane. So those are big reeds. I find on my bassoon that that plays flat. And I've tried and tried to get those to work, and I just end up almost biting through my lips. But the wideness of the blade is really important. It helps the low end in particular, getting things to be secure. It also, I tried when I first got this instrument, I tried playing much smaller reeds. And there are people who play smaller reeds than this. And it more or less worked, but I couldn't get the variety of tone colors I was after. I couldn't play quietly effectively. And if you're playing a lot of continuo parts and you have to blend with a cello all the time, if you can't play, pianissimo effectively, you're just gonna have your lips fall off. So I moved to the larger reed. At first, even being shorter than what some people use, I couldn't play it in tune. I was constantly playing it like 405 or something way flatter than I should have been. But it was a process of, I had to almost start over again at that point with how I was using air, how I was voicing, and all of that. I scrape these much less than I scrape my modern reeds. My modern reed, I want the tip to be very, very thin. Baroque reed, looks almost like a couple of planks compared to the modern reed, but it does still taper out towards the edges. The tube is much flatter on the Baroque reed, at least, and I should say this is my particular style. There's lots of reed styles out there, just as with modern reeds. My style is based largely on the style of Dominic Teresi, who plays a Wolf Scherer, like you guys will have very soon, as his primary instrument. And the flatness of the tube, I found, did also make a big difference in the flexibility, and particularly dynamic flexibility for that. So whereas on the modern reed, my second wire is not entirely round, but going in that direction, it's very, very flat on this. And in fact, I don't use long pins to form Baroque reeds because I want the tube to be so flat.
So I don't know if I've ever told the students in the studio, but there are some early reed making methods, including the one in the Otzi treatise, that actually advise leaving a lot of bark on the reed and gouging and thinning the reed from the inside. Instead of scraping the outside, they thin it from the inside. Have you ever experimented with that style of reed, Dave, for your 19th century bassoons?
I have tried it. Here are my two Otzi reeds that I tried to make.
Yeah.
I started out with about 5 pieces of cane and got 2 sort of reed-shaped objects. So these I hand gouged, internally scraped, hand shaped, hand profiled everything. And probably if I had tried any of those processes before, I would have been more successful. But these sort of make noise. You might be able to see this one, how separate the blades are.
Yeah.
And this apparently happens with these internally scraped reeds, because you're taking out all the stuff from the middle and it they dry that way. So you have to soak them for a long, long time. Um, it was enough to do this once and say, okay, now I have a vague idea of how this process works. Let's never do it again.
Yeah, and the I believe that the logic for that scraping was to help extend the high register. That you got a little bit, well, not a little bit. You got a significantly denser kind of cane, because if you're gouging out the softer inner part, you're necessarily going towards the outer part near the bark. So how would you describe I mean, on your Eichentopf, the Baroque style bassoon, what's about the highest level, highest note you can comfortably go with that?
It pretty much tops out at A.
Okay.
Let's see. I haven't played A today. And that gets you through most repertoire. You know, there are high A's in like the Dard sonatas, fair amount of Rameau orchestral literature, some of the Corette.
Yeah.
Delice de Solitude goes up to A. But that's about it. You know, Rameau did write some B flats and I think even B naturals. I have yet to have to play one. I've sort of, you know, experimented trying to get higher on this instrument just to, develop my comfort in the high range. But A is pretty much it so far.
Well, that explains why, when we're playing the Mozart concerto, we don't even think twice that it's got a high B flat in it. But certainly any person playing it in Mozart's time would have had that would have been part of the virtuosity inherent in that piece, to be able to go that high. And you notice that he only did it at the very end and not again. But okay, so you mentioned Rameau, and you told me when I was visiting recently about one of your performing ensembles where you played some chamber music of Rameau. So let's get back to how you've incorporated these instruments into your playing career, and actually making a living doing this now. Excuse me, I've got to just get Astro out of my lap. Okay, so tell us about the groups that you currently perform with, and the variety of sizes of the ensembles, the variety of the repertoire, the way a period instrument player has to come to a gig. You know, you've got different instruments for different pitches. I don't know if anybody in the studio saw Dave's post yesterday of the 4 different bassoons and 4 different pitches playing the Mozart concerto opening. You don't think about that when you're playing the modern bassoon, and you're just expected to play at 440 and that's it. So tell us a little bit about how you've made a career with these instruments.
Sure. And really my career as a period instrument player has only started in the last few years. You know, after the great thing about being at Wisconsin with Mark was that he had instruments to loan, and the bad thing was when I graduated, I didn't have the instruments to borrow anymore. So I was without any period instruments for 5 or 6 years until I bought my Baroque Bassoon and started sort of getting back into it. I've been working, I'd say, the last 3 or 4 years or something like that. But yeah, it is a concern about pitches, especially once as you get into the sort of early instrument freelancing world, and you know, a lot of people are playing at a lot of different pitches, and you might get contracted by someone who you've known through a period instrument ensemble, but then they tell you, oh no, but this is a modern instrument group that's playing. So anytime there's any question, I fire back, okay, what's our pitch for this? So far I haven't had any problems with that. You know, there's stories of people showing up. I think this is more likely to happen in Europe, where there's more like playing at 392 going on, of, you know, showing up to a gig with the wrong instrument, or having been told the wrong instrument, or get there and the conductor decides he wants a different pitch or something, which is, you know, workable for strings to some degree, but not winds. There's a lot of sort of piecemeal work in the period instrument world. You know, there are some ensembles who do a lot of sets. You know, like Tafel Music in Toronto comes to mind as being, you know, really basically a full-time group, more or less. But that's not the situation of most of them. For most of them, it's, you know, a handful of projects within a year. So there's a lot of, you know, it's very much a freelance kind of world for most people. In Sacramento, I play with 3 groups which have, even within them, varying sizes and frequency of performances. One, Sinfonia Spirituosa, is a group that some colleagues and friends and I have just sort of started up in the last couple of years, and we're still very much in the getting going phase. And that's meant to be a chamber orchestra. So, and a Baroque chamber orchestra, smaller than you might think of for like a Mozart chamber orchestra. So I think we've been as many as 17 or 18. But we also do smaller stuff. We've done things with 3 or 4 people as well, depending on repertoire and the venue. The 2 others in town, Sacramento Baroque Soloists, have been going for quite a long time. They have a really great established following in town, and they hire me for 1 or a couple of sets per year. And they're kind enough to let me play solo stuff a fair amount, which is a lot of fun. And there's the other period instrument group in town is it's really a choir that hires a period instrument orchestra once or twice a year. And there's a lot of groups like that around. Some of the playing I've done in the Bay Area is that kind of thing. You know, a choir that will, when they do want orchestral accompaniment, they will hire a group for the period of whatever they're performing. So I've done some Handel that way. Was supposed to be doing some Vivaldi that way next month, and it's been canceled already because of all the restrictions. Then there's, you know, other groups, some other big established groups out here, like Philharmonia Orchestra, the American Bach Soloists, and the Bach Soloists. I've played with them a few times now. I should say that as cliche as it is, a lot of this is about networking. That it's very, very rare for there to be an audition for a group. You know, Tafel Music, Dominic Teresi is the bassoonist of Tafel Music. Sometimes they hire a second, and he, I think, basically decides who that's going to be. You know, Philharmonia has auditions, but I don't know that they've had any wind auditions anytime in recent memory. So most of the groups, it really is freelancing, and it's meeting people, playing with them. I know, particularly with the American Bach Soloists, they have a summer academy, and that's how I got in playing with them. Is that I attended their summer academy a few years ago, and they evidently liked what I did, and probably also liked that I'm semi-local, so they wanted to pay for a plane ticket for me. And so that's how I got in there, and then I met other people, and you know, I could really trace pretty much every gig I've gotten. I could trace to a particular interaction, a particular other gig, or you know, academy sort of setting like the Bach Soloists.
Great. Okay, well, before we go on to the next topic, does anyone in the studio have a final question about any of the Baroque or classical instruments, or the reeds, or the style, anything like that? Okay, well, another area of which you really excelled, Dave, is that you were one of the first bassoonists I know who started an active blog and got a following on it. And one of the things that I think attracts people to your blog is your collection of early bassoon recordings and your what we'll generally call your bassoon esoterica. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in these collections, and how you find items, how you go about purchasing them, you know, what some of the more interesting things are that you found. So what got you interested in early recordings?
That I think I got there through my dissertation, which I think I mentioned, history and discography of the bassoon in jazz. And for that, I was particularly interested in seeing how early the bassoon had been used. And it turns out very early, you know, the 1920s. Basically, as soon as there was something really called jazz, you can find examples of bassoon in there. Um, and I had marshaled all the library resources I could when I was doing that research. And Wisconsin has an incredible sound recordings collection, so there's a lot of stuff I got there. Um, and their interlibrary loan is very dogged in their pursuit of items, so I got things that way as well. But there were, even afterwards, even after I was done with the degree and whatnot, there were some things that I hadn't been able to find, so I just continued hunting for them. And eBay has been one of the great research tools for this, because there aren't always complete discographies for particular labels or particular performers or things. But if somebody sells it, then you can pick it up and or even just find out about it, even if you happen to not win it. But luckily, there has not been other great demand for early bassoon recordings thus far. So I've been pretty successful in getting things through there and through other venues as well. And pretty quickly, I started doing searches for bassoon and started finding more straight ahead classical things or the sort of novelty songs that I've posted some of.
Yeah, it's funny. You just posted that excerpt from the Ubadu recording of what used to be called the Mozart Second Concerto, and gosh, about 25 years ago or something, maybe even longer than that, Henk de Wit, a Dutch bassoonist, recorded or released a CD of several excerpts of things from his collection, and it included that recording on there. So I had heard that before, but what I found interesting about the excerpt that you played and that reminded me of this is that Ubadu was one of the earliest French players, I think, to even have a demonstrable vibrato at times on it. Like some of the earliest recordings, they just don't sound like they're using any at all. And he really has had a beautiful singing tone. Have you used these recordings, or have you been able to, or even like gone down this road yet to sort of trace the development of style from the earliest recording era to today? I always find that when I'm listening to recordings from the 20s, I'm surprised at the again, we'll use that word, flexibility of pitch or approach to pitch, and I'm sure that part of it is recording technology. And there is a company, I think we were talking about this, where a new French company is re-releasing piano recordings from that era that have been they've been analyzed, and they have stabilized the pitch and the sound much better. And it's amazing the difference even in the apparent musicality that you can hear in it. So I wonder if, as you've heard these performances over decades, how would you characterize the sort of the trajectory of bassoon playing in any kind of topic, like either vibrato or darkness or brightness of sound? Have you noticed something like that?
Yeah, well, certainly your point about vibrato is really applicable to this. There's so much variety, and particularly a lot of the early recordings, there's very little, if any, vibrato in the bassoon sound. And as you mentioned, Ubadu has a bit, but it's definitely noticeable. And then you hear it pop up, I think, more as it gets later, as you get to later recordings. But it's kind of surprising how little there is in even the first half of the 20th century, really. And I think it's also helpful to hear all the sort of larger variety of sound concepts from the period as well. I mean, for one thing, it's the time when the French and German systems were reasonably evenly matched, and there was a lot of I think some crossover in sound, and you get examples of people switching systems for various reasons, and then there's a question of do they retain their old sound concept on the new horn, or do they switch entirely to get a different sound, or are they doing it begrudgingly because someone told them they had to, or whatnot? So there's just a lot of variety in the sounds. In a more musical sort of not specifically the bassoon, you mentioned recording technology, and one of the things about the flexibility of pitch, the occasional missed attack, the things that happen in there, especially in the earlier things, early 1940s and before, they were dealing with a technology that allowed for no editing.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting in a lot of cases a much truer depiction of performance than we get once we get into the era of magnetic tape, and we can start splicing, and we get these perfect recordings.
Right.
So it's been very illustrative to listen to that and think about changes in ideas about what performance should sound like, and changes in standards and things like that.
Yeah. So let's go to your other collections, like the esoterica.
Sure.
What is some of the most unusual things that you've found over the years that that have either been included iconography of the bassoon, or maybe some equipment, or publications?
Yeah, there's the stuff I collect. I've got, I don't know, it's just this whole range of stuff. Some of it's greeting cards, early 20th century greeting cards with bassoonists on them, or little ensembles with bassoons in them. Some of you may have seen some of these. I tend to post, like the Christmas ones. I'll post one at Christmas, and I'll post a New Year's one at New Year's. One thing that's led me to believe is that there was a time when the general public had a good idea of what a bassoon is.
Right. Yes.
All these cards out there are being sent around with these things. I've been very interested in sort of the history of music history through its players, and often we don't get a lot of biographical information about players, especially orchestral players. And so one area of my collecting has been in trying to find photos and engravings of players, and there's some who I've never seen photos of elsewhere that I've been able to find, like Paul. Here, do you want me to share?
Sure.
A screen share here. Paul Cruz, who was the principal bassoonist of the Chicago Symphony right around the turn of the 20th century. Happened to find some photos of him being sold. Here he is with his wife, Elise Cruz. I hadn't found any photos of him anywhere. I managed to pick up something from one of his descendants' estates was being sold, and there were a number of photos and things in there. So putting faces to names who are otherwise just sort of these semi-anonymous figures has been really interesting. And I have a number of sort of long-term projects going on with this. This is one of those that I want to sort of flesh out some of these players. Iconography has also been sort of helpful in my work with the bassoon and jazz. In a lot of discographies, you'll see, especially in dance bands or big bands, you'll see people credited with just playing reeds. It's like, okay, what's that? Is that alto saxophone and bass clarinet? What is it? And seeing photos of bands has been in identifying which ones actually had bassoons and which ones I should try to hunt down recordings for, and listen for a bassoonist. So you can see this whole fleet of reed instruments in front of these.
Yeah, I hope they got cartage in their contracts or something.
I hope so. And those stands look just so rickety that they're on, but
anyway.
Yeah. Recordings have been a big part of this as well. Some sheet music, we mentioned some of those novelty recordings I found. I've been finding sheet music for some of these as well. So planning some blog posts about some of these that are more than I can fit in Instagram, with recordings and scans of sheet music and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been some of these things are just helpful in my own understanding of these pieces, and getting a little more in depth into histories of pieces. Another one I posted about recently was the Burl Phillips concert piece.
Oh yeah.
Which in its first version was called American Dance for Bassoon and String Orchestra. And as far as I can tell, there was never a score published with that title, but its initial recording had that. And this is also, the only really solo recording I found of Vincent Pezzi. Um, so
Yeah, and he sounded really great in that. That I mean,
yeah,
it's not one of my favorite pieces, but he was convincing me that it was better than I thought.
well, yeah, yeah. So that this is another arm of my quest to sort of flesh out what we know about these players. That if you do a search in IDRS for Vincent Pezzi, his name comes up a lot as being
Yeah,
part of the lineages of teacher lineages for or all sorts of players. Um, but if we don't have this recording, we don't know what he sounds like.
yeah.
Um,
Let's see. Yeah, I remember on your blog you also found that first recording of the Hindemith Sonata by my teacher, your grand teacher,
yeah.
Bernard Garfield, and it's funny that he never even told me or us about that. I mean, I didn't even know that he'd ever recorded that, and it seems like that group of players in New York in right after the war, they were just so active and so just took up so many initiatives that there's got to be more gems out there from that period that we haven't found yet. But well, this is a good segue then into the other side of your appointment, which is teaching music history. And I was hoping you could talk to us now about that, because you didn't specifically, I don't believe, um, plan for a dual appointment career, did you?
Sort of.
Okay.
At Wisconsin, for the DMA program, you pick a doctoral minor, and
Okay.
although that can theoretically be anything, and I knew people who were getting degrees in composition with minors in environmental science or things like that.
Mhm.
History and theory are the most common things. Um, and I was lucky enough to have a TA position at Wisconsin that was uh, involved teaching or being a TA for music appreciation class. So working with the musicology faculty through there. And so between those two things, that I had picked music history as my minor. I've always had a sort of uh, you know interest in history and sort of scholarly bent in that
Mhm.
direction. So between that and getting to work closely with some of the musicology teachers, I realized fairly quickly that the difference between me getting a DMA with a doctoral minor in musicology and me getting a DMA in bassoon and an MA in musicology was 1 year of paper and a test.
Huh.
So I decided to take an extra year at Wisconsin basically to get the master's in history. So I was sort of seeing the kinds of jobs people were getting, not just bassoonists, but instrumental teachers in general, and there being for X instrument and theory or Y instrument and history, various things. So I thought that could only enhance my sort of marketability in that respect. Um,
Yeah,
and
and to everybody in the studio, that's exactly the kind of thing that you can start as early as you want. I mean, you don't necessarily have to wait until a doctoral degree. The more that you say, if you do have really good chops in theory or in history or any other secondary music discipline, there are going to be jobs out there that specify bassoon and a second area. Sometimes they'll be flexible. Sometimes they're flexible because they know that their studio is never going to be full size, where you could only teach bassoon in their university. But other times they may have medium-sized studio and a greater need for teachers who can do either part of the core curriculum or part of the sort of the non-major curriculum. So, Dave, do you teach music students primarily or non-music students?
I have some of each. I cycle through our music history surveys for majors. Um, we have a 3-semester sequence. So right now, this semester is classical and romantic. And then I also, so that's the one I sort of planned for. But the one I didn't plan for is the general education music class I teach to non-majors, which is just called Basic Music We start at the very beginning. This is a quarter note. This is the staff. Here's your recorder. Let's all play some quarter notes together. And my particular section of that class is 130 students at once. And so that I did not plan for. So that that has been quite an education for me in figuring out how to teach a class that size. And that size is pretty typical, I think, for general education classes in a lot of institutions. How to teach at such a basic level, the things that probably everyone in this call doesn't remember learning.
Right.
How to go back and think about that as a beginner and make it make sense to beginners.
So we all have the experience of one-on-one teaching. So what are some of the biggest differences between studio teaching and large format classes teaching for you?
I mean, one of the big things is just the degree to which you get to know the students. And it all comes, especially in that very large class I have, it comes down to who among them decides to interact with me, more or less. Because, it's very possible for someone to go in there and, never really say a word to me, except the couple of times that they're in-person playing tests through the course of the semester. My history class with the music majors, that's certainly better in that respect. There's the community within the School of Music, and that works out well. But preparation is a huge different thing. For a lesson, as long as I'm pretty sure I can play that Mildy study and that movement of Weber, I'm prepared for the lesson more or less.
Right.
But to give an hour and 15-minute music history lecture, that's a much more serious amount of preparation. And luckily, it's the kind of thing that you can reuse and build on year after year. But every year I tweak things and I change orders around and I add materials or change the recording I'm using or the video I'm showing or the ties I'm making to things. One particularly interesting thing I find with that is that as I myself play more repertoire, that changes how I teach. So like in the last year, and especially with period instrument stuff, in the last year I've played Mendelssohn's Elijah and Haydn's Creation for the first time. And I'm teaching both of those this semester. So last time I taught them, I had not ever performed either of them. So I think it is really nice to be able to bring a performer's perspective into the history classroom. And for whatever, there's certainly many arguments for having a full-time musicologist teaching all the music history classes, but I do think there are things that we can offer as performers that many of them can't.
So one final area that you've distinguished yourself in is, you mentioned jazz history before, but jazz performance too. How did you, I think you mentioned that you were doing that fairly early on, but tell us a little bit about your training in jazz.
Sure. I hesitate to call myself a jazz musician. So I don't have the real training of a jazz musician. I am a bassoonist who improvises, but I did get my start in doing that in graduate school. I took a jazz improvisation class at University of Wisconsin, and had a great teacher, Les Themig, there, he's the saxophone teacher, but he plays every clarinet, saxophone, and flute ever invented. He's an incredible composer and both classical jazz, all sorts of stuff. He's has a very diverse background and training, and he's very open to all sorts of instruments within jazz. So there are certainly people out there who would have seen a bassoonist sign up for their jazz improvisation class and told them to get out or made them not feel comfortable or whatever. But he was very, very welcoming, and I took a couple of semesters of that actually, and then after the second semester, he said, "Hey, I run one of the jazz combos. Why don't you audition for it next semester?" So I did that and played in that group for the remainder of my time at Wisconsin, basically. And we had often very strange instrumentations, bassoon, alto sax, trombone, vibraphone, bass drums. was 1 year, I think. But we all had to arrange tunes for the group. We played only arrangements done by people in the ensemble, so that was great. And then when we moved to California, I mentioned my wife got the job first, and I was just I spent a year kind of as a bum networking and taking every gig that I could find, and that included looking on Craigslist for musicians wanted, and I found this group. Said Gypsy Jazz Ensemble looking for a violin, clarinet, or other melody instrument. So I wrote to them and said, "How serious are you about this other thing?"
Yeah.
And they said, "Well, sure, why not?" So I got together and jammed with them, and I've been playing with them ever since. And that's pretty much the only thing I've done out here is playing with that group, and that's stuff in this sort of style of, or kind of inspired by the style of Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli.
Okay. We got a question from Peter again, back about music history teaching. So Peter, why don't you ask your question?
Oh, sorry. My question about music history teaching was just, is there anything looking back that you maybe wish you had done during your degrees to better prepare you for that, first music history class that you were teaching?
There have definitely been times that I've looked at things and wished that I had paid better attention in my own music history surveys. That I read and like, oh, I must have learned that originally, but I don't really remember that at all. So now I have to relearn it and learn it well enough to teach it. I can't think of any specific examples at the moment, but that was one big thing. I wish now that I had, just from a purely practical perspective, I wish I had saved my tests. So that when I go to write a test, I had a little more had some other models and ideas about the kinds of questions that seemed to work well from my perspective as a student and didn't seem to work well, things like that. And just the formatting, not even the formatting, but the structure and that sort of thing. I wish I'd saved more of those kinds of class documents, syllabi, schedules, exams, whatnot, because it's so much easier to create those things if you have at least a jumping off point. And I had a couple of things, but not as much as I would have liked.
It's funny how long I kept my notes from every class I took as in my master's and doctorate. And even for the longest time, just through several moves, I still had my theory textbook from my undergrad. I don't know why I was going to need to talk to somebody about the analysis of the Tristan prelude, but I thought I was going to have to. And so I finally threw it out.
I saved my notes because that's what I thought I would need, but what I actually needed were the things that I did throw out, the course documents that I didn't think I would ever want to see again.
Right. So I think we've basically covered my outline so far. And I just want to remind everybody, don't forget that Dave actually does teach and play modern bassoon too.
Oh, yeah.
But this,
most of what I teach.
yeah, it's just been important over these 4 different classes where we had Ryan Reynolds of Acropolis, Kristen Schillinger of Ithaca College, Juan DeGomar, and you now to sort of just take a step back and look at the depth and breadth of this discipline. And you come into this world of playing bassoon, and you kind of are presented with the idea that there's one thing to do, that you sit in an orchestra and you sit there or there, sometimes over there, but that's what you do. And that I'm glad that all 4 of our guests this year have really shown that idea just can be exploded. And so before we sign off, I'll ask the studio one more time. Is there anything else that anyone wants to ask, or any topics that we touched upon that we didn't sort of go into greater depth with? Okay, Daniel.
Hi, yeah. I was just wondering, how do you find the balance between everything that you do and find efficiently putting in the effort and energy that you need and being successful in all of it, I guess?
It's a challenge, and that balance is certainly one thing I've struggled with the most. I find, particularly if you're talking about going between instruments that I find it best to have a decent amount of lead time before a gig on, if I'm going to play modern bassoon one weekend and Baroque bassoon the next weekend, then I better, after that modern bassoon gig is over, Monday morning I'd better be, at least thinking about getting my Baroque bassoon out and playing some long tones, playing some scales to get back in the world of 415, to get my embouchure adjusted, all that stuff. And some of it's also just been a matter of trying to pace it a little bit. Of course, the more of each thing I do, the better I get at switching between them. So sometimes it's a struggle the first time I do something. Like the first time I played the classical bassoon, that was a struggle, very definitely. I'm feeling a bit better about it now. I've still not played it nearly as much as I played the Baroque bassoon, so I wouldn't be able to jump to that as quickly. I would need to plan, lead time for that as well. But that goes for things, different styles on modern bassoon too. If I've been playing orchestra gigs and then I have something with my swing band, I'd better spend some time improvising before I go in there, or I'm going to sound square. I'm going to sound too much like a bassoonist.
So what, Daniel's question led me to this. The personal situation we're all in now. How has the virus impacted your job? And your state was one of the first to actually have shelter-in-place orders, that we share with you now, and you're faced both with teaching the large class online, I believe, as well as continuing the lessons. How has everyone been faring out there?
So far it's been all right. We've just had 1 week of online teaching so far. We canceled classes for a week, and then had a week last week of teaching, and things went fairly well. With that week off, I spent a lot of time experimenting and trying out tech setups and whatnot. And I think things went okay this last week. I did live classes with my music history class and my basic music class, and then the lessons. Of course, I guess you've all experienced that.
Yeah.
That's been fine. So the university stuff is continuing probably in a very similar way to how yours is. I've thus far only one canceled. There was a canceled gig a week or 2 weekends ago. I had kind of a light late March, early April, luckily, but I've already had things in April and May canceled.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm waiting to hear about summer stuff, and who knows.
Right. Well, I have another question from Allison going back to Baroque. Allison, why don't you chime in?
Yeah, I'm learning or looking at the Correct sonatas at the moment, and I'm wondering if you have any pieces of advice for that repertoire or other repertoire from that period for best transition to the modern instrument.
Listen to, particularly for the French repertoire, I think in a lot of ways, French Baroque repertoire is the most subtle and is maybe more different from, say, either German or Italian repertoire than German and Italian are from each other, or English or whatever. The way ornaments are used is distinct. The idea of notes inégales, this sort of what we might think of as kind of like a swing rhythm, is not really present elsewhere. I would say find as many good recordings of not only those pieces themselves, but other pieces by Correct, other repertoire from about the same time, to just really immerse yourself in the style, and really do try to listen to what people are doing on period instruments and see what you can emulate. But with many of those Correct sonatas, and actually a lot of particularly French repertoire that was published as being for bassoon or viol or cello or whatever, find people playing it on the viola da gamba, find people playing it on the Baroque cello, and hear how they approach things. I think that can be very informative of course, also, I mean, to really do it, you got to get in and read treatises, read your Auteuil, in particular, and for them, I'm blanking on the name.
Debord or oh, Francoeur?
No, it's probably right behind me. Aha. Frayon Pensée, my French.
Oh yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, to read about the ornamentation and the approach to phrasing and melody and all that. So I think a combination of listening and reading, and just sort of immersing yourself in the sound can be very, very helpful.
And I have another question from Marissa about your blog. And while you are answering that, I have to let Chase out in the backyard. Sorry, he's been whining and staring at me for quite a while. So I'll be right back. Marissa?
Yeah, so I'm actually in the process of creating my own blog, and we're going to publish it very soon. So I was wondering if you had any tips for creating a successful blog and how to engage an online audience and things to that effect.
Yeah, and I should maybe preface this by saying that I've been very bad about engaging my audience via my blog lately. I think my last post is maybe 3 years ago at this point. I started posting more things on Instagram and Facebook and whatnot. That's one of my coronavirus resolutions is to get back to doing things there. But I found that it's always worked for me to just write about what I'm interested in, and that always has produced more compelling, things that are more compelling to read than if I'm trying to find things that I think will interest other people necessarily. Because I just think the way it comes out and the interest you put into your work will show that way. And I've often been surprised at the things that I've put up there that generate a response from people. It's like, oh, I thought this was made like the nerdiest thing possible, and only I was ever going to read it. But then I get comments from people and reactions, and people mention things. And,
The funny thing you mentioned about nerdy reactions, I was pleasantly shocked at how many people immediately logged into Juan's class that we've had up for about a week and a half, and hopefully we'll be logging into yours too. And I think if there's anything positive at all about this virus and its impact on the bassoon world, is our channel is getting thousands of views. And so I think there's a lot of bassoonists out there with very little to do. So if we can continue to provide them with their versions and more music and discussions, that's a great thing in this time. So okay, I think that's a good way to close. So I want to thank you again, Dave, for all of your time and attention today. And we will be constantly checking in once those instruments arrive and we need reed measurements or advice on fingerings or on anything about the Baroque period. So the Baroque bassoon. So again, thanks to everyone in the studio, and thanks to you, Dave, and thanks to everybody out in the internet world watching us. And shelter in your safe place, and we will see you soon. So I'm going to stop this recording.